To what extent did social and economic factors create conflict in the 5th century BC Greece? A potentially tricky question, but I'm going to show you a structure where you could deal with this quite effectively and not just consider it a really tricky curveball. So obviously this paper works in two ways. You've got the modern historian debate. So you get one of these three debates where you have to use ancient sources and examples to either agree with a modern historian or to, and do both, to challenge the view of the modern historian. It's a 20-mark question that you complete in 30 minutes. And then you've got two of the essay questions to deal with in 45 minutes, and these are worth 30 marks. The important thing with the essay question is to have a structure, to have examples, and to have links with sources. And of course, if you're given an essay question with no time frame, you're expected to dip into the different time zones of the module. If there is a time zone, obviously stick to that time zone. So what do I mean by the different time zones? You've got you could argue that there are 5 key time zones in the module. So the Persian Wars, first of all, would be one time zone with the links to Herodotus and the various archaeological sources. The creation of the Delian League and its transition into the Athenian Empire, which kind of culminates in 454 BC when the treasuries moved from Delos to Athens, and of course mentioning the Peace of Callias in 449. Then the increasing tensions between the Athenians and the Peloponnesian powers, such as Corcyra, Potidaea, the Megarian Decree, and then those various debates as mentioned by Thucydides that lead to the Spartan ultimatum and the declaration of war. And then in regard to the Peloponnesian War itself, you could split that into two: the Archidamian War and those annual invasions, Pylos, Brasidas' Thracian campaigns, the Peace of Nicias and its collapse, and then the Sicilian expedition. You could package that with the Ionian War and finish off the Peloponnesian War and the defeat of Athens after the Battle of Aegospotami. So crucially, if you get a question without a time zone, you're going to be expected to dip into each of these time zones. If you do get a time zone, stick to the time zone. So what would an economic question look like? Well, here's a past paper question. The economic effects of conflict on Athens and her allies were far greater than the effects on Sparta and her allies. To what extent is this a fair assessment? And then crucially, again, it's all about having a structure in your head about how to deal with these questions. So how do we deal with this? Well, first of all, we could look at the development of the Delian League into the Athenian Empire from 460 to 431. We could look at tribute lists, the Chalcis Decree, Plutarch's coverage of Aristides, even though it's slightly earlier than 460, of course, all part of Thucydides' Pentaconta Etia. We could certainly look at the episodes leading up to the war in regard to the economic motives behind Corinth's opposition of Corcyra joining the Athenian Empire, Potidaea wanting to leave the Athenian Empire, and Plataea as well, with details from Thucydides. We could talk about the annual campaigns undertaken by the Spartans against Attica as part of Archidamus' strategy. The Allied Congress in Sparta is pretty good because Corinth uses a range of economic arguments about how the Peloponnesians could cut off Athens from its allies and its supply of tribute. The economic impacts of the plague are pretty useful because you can use the Thudipos decree to say how that links to Athenian treatment of their own allies. The Sicilian expedition's effects in Athens, as covered by Thucydides. Certainly the occupation of Decelea and its consequences, which Thucydides says is really dramatic and does have an impact on the Athenians and their ability to fight effectively. And finally, the involvement of Persia in the final years, and Xenophon's coverage of that. And certainly Sparta's relationship with her allies are pretty useful as well. So how can we start off this? Well, what we could start off with is we could start about the development of the Delian League into the Athenian Empire. And Thucydides gives us a really interesting example in Book 1, verse 99. Now, remember, Thucydides is really spectacularly useful as a contemporary actor in these events. Of course, even when he's talking about events that were before he was born, or when he was extremely little, certainly before he was born, he's still really, really effective because he can speak to either elderly Athenians or Athenians that are in their teens at these times. So he is, again, pretty reliable. Also, you've got all of the information from Thucydides early on in his works where he tells you about how he's going to write his history and how he's going to check his facts. And he is, very, very useful in telling us this information. So in 199, he tells us that the Delian League started off with only smaller states providing tribute. And over time, more and more of these states opted to pay Athens instead of performing undertaking the fighting. So the Athenian allies basically paid Athens tribute, and then Athens used that tribute to build more and more triremes. Crucially, if one ally went rogue, like this one, and refused to pay its tribute, like Naxos, for example, the Athenians could use their superior force to intimidate and force the ally back into the league. And it's why Thucydides blames the allies themselves for letting the Athenians get so powerful. Now, you could easily corroborate this with the Chalcis decree, which really does show the practicalities of Athenian control over its own allies in an archaeological bit of evidence. You could also use your knowledge of the tribute lists to show how Athenian tribute further squeezed the allies over time. You could then discuss the issue of stability between the Peloponnesian League and the Delian League and the issue of tribute. Now, of course, we do have a lack of Spartan evidence. The Spartans are laconical, which means they don't value things such as writing histories, building snazzy Parthenons, things like that. So we do have a lack of Spartan evidence. Thucydides, in an off-spec verse, does tells a little bit about why the Peloponnesian League is more stable. And he says it's because there's no tribute and because ideologically they have to be the same. All the allies in the Peloponnesian League are governed by oligarchies. It's in this section as well that he says that the Athenians took over the fleets of their allies and made the allies pay tribute. So basically Thucydides does admit that the issue of tribute in the Delian League certainly does affect its stability, whereas in the Peloponnesian League that's just not an issue because there is no tribute and ideologically they're all the same. You could then focus on the actual economic impacts of the war. So the cause of the Peloponnesian War are particularly useful. You could talk about the Megarian decree here, which is really great because it allows you to discuss Athens blocking Megara from using its markets, which is almost a form of economic warfare. Thucydides doesn't give you too much information then, but then you can link that really effectively to Pericles' motives as covered by Plutarch in terms of a diversion of the trial of his men, of his friend Phidias, or Aristophanes' Arcanians, when he says it's all for much more smuttier motives in defending his mistress Aspasia. Thirdly, you could talk about Sparta's annual invasions and the impact of that on Athens and the fact that the Athenians have to evacuate their population into Attica each year and the devastation that causes. Interestingly, you could make the off-piste comment that Plutarch compares Pericles to Fabius Maximus for that, pretty much the same reason. The Corinthian strategies given at the Allied Congress are really useful because they really do aim at hitting Athens in the wallet. So the Corinthians do tell the various states at the Allied Congress about how to defeat the Athenians in terms of building up their forces, and raiding Athenian treasuries, and basically start creating revolts in northern Greece so Athens can't use tribute any longer. So those Corinthian strategies are really, really, really quite useful because, again, that's all about focused on economic hits that they can attack with the Athenians with. And of course, bring in your Thucydides source analysis points at that particular section. You could discuss the impacts of the plague on Athens, and this gives you a really good opportunity to use the Thudipos decree to say how Athens started to increase its tribute. There's a little bit on that increase in tribute in Plutarch's coverage of Aristides. The Brasidas Thracian campaigns, you could link to the Allied Congress because that's where those strategies are put into action in terms of robbing Athens of its ability to gain tribute from its northern allies. You can skip forward to Alcibiades' treachery in regard to the Sicilian disaster, of course, in advising the Spartans to send Gylippus, but also Decelea, that fort, which really does cause Athens some problems. So the Spartans occupy that fort following Alcibiades' advice, and we're told by Thucydides that causes unbelievable suffering in Athens because it means that the Athenians can't farm the land that they're near and also can't use the overland routes to their livestock in Euboea, so they have to ship everything by sea, which is way more expensive. Of course, the impacts of the Sicilian expedition's disaster is huge. 30,000 dead, including Nicias and Demosthenes, panic, suspension of the democracy, the use of Pericles' emergency funds, the fortification of Sunium, and interestingly, a 5% tax replacing the tribute. We've also got a shipbuilding program in Sparta, allied revolts which further hit Athens in the wallet, and the Treaty of Miletus, where Sparta decides to swap the Ionian Greeks for silver in order to build its own fleet to challenge the Athenians. Of course, you could always make the link here that there had already been attempts from both sides to gain Persian aid in the 420s anyway. So you could discuss those various options about why they want to bring in the Persians. And of course, the reason why the Persians are so useful is because of the wealth that they bring. We've got a few examples. For example, in 425, when a Persian message to Sparta is intercepted and read out in 425. In Aristophanes' play The Orcanians in 427, we've got an embassy arriving just from Persia, so it clearly shows that this is a realistic thing, and you could bring in your source analysis points of Aristophanes at that point. And Athens' deal in 424, as referred to by Andocides, and the attempt to gain Persian support much earlier on in the war, as referred to as the Peace of Epicelius. So why is Sparta able to gain support right at the end of the Peloponnesian War? Well, that's because by that point, Darius II was secure on his throne and had dispatched two of his satraps to recover tribute from the Ionians, Tissaphernes and Pharnabazus. And Tissaphernes, under the influence of Alcibiades, had made a deal with the Spartans. And at this point, those allied revolts really start to bite. Certainly in regard to the Persian aid that goes to Athens, the motives of Tissaphernes and Pharnabazus really do restrict how effective they are in actually accomplishing that. So Tissaphernes and Pharnabazus are there to try and gain tribute for Darius, but also to create a Greek alliance with Sparta, and that would give them credit. The Athenians, meanwhile, are anxious that the revolt of Chios would mean that more allies would revolt, and that would further impede their ability to gain tribute in order to facilitate the war. So really what we've got in the final bit of Thucydides is what's actually offered to the sailors of Miletus. It tells you the going money, 1 month's pay, 3 obols initially, and then 1 drachma a day. You could then finish off this with the coverage in Xenophon between Lysander and Cyrus, when Cyrus basically promises to fund the campaign himself and almost gives Lysander an open checkbook. And of course, you could then use your source analysis for Xenophon. So economic factors are really important in terms of tribute, in terms of the stability of different alliances, and the economic factors are also important because they also form the basis of strategies used by the different sides to try and injure the other.